If you enjoy content that actually takes time to make, show some love. Like, subscribe, and comment. I remembered the cold of the northern wastes as a clean, predictable thing, a white canvas upon which the Empire imposed its order. But when the transport finally set me down at Stone Fang Outpost, the cold felt different. It was an absence. I was Investigator Graven Hardlow, 33 years old, and my job was to find reasons. I expected scorched earth, bodies, or the crude markings of savage raiders, the usual excuses offered by bureaucracy for a failed border defense. Instead, I found nothing. Stone Fang, a complex designed to hold 50 officers and 200 auxiliary troops, was empty. Not looted, not burned, but simply vacant. The soup kettle in the mess hall still hung on its iron hook, solidified grease clinging to the sides. Uniforms lay folded on bunks. Every soul had simultaneously walked out the back gate and vanished into the permanent twilight of the snow. The atmosphere was an oppressive, breath-stealing quiet, heavier than any blizzard. I checked the perimeter. The walls were intact. The automated fire traps were functional. Yet the silence was absolute, penetrating even the thick fur of my traveling coat. This was not the silence of death. It was the silence of non-existence. I spent the first hour searching, moving through the barracks and command center. The only real evidence I found was outside, far from the fort's main road. On the pristine, wind-packed snow, stretching southward for as far as the eye could see, were massive, perfectly level trenches. They were too broad to have been made by a sled, too uniform to be natural fissures. They looked like something colossal had been dragged across the landscape, not violently but smoothly, erased as it passed. I went straight for the communications mast, a fusion of complex Imperial technology and rudimentary Earth magic. I needed to report back to Lunar Tower, the capital, 30 days march south. I began the activation sequences. The panels lit up exactly as they should have. The gears turned with precision. But when I tried to send a coded burst, there was no connection. This wasn't static. This wasn't interference. A terrifying void existed at the other end. I tried the secondary channels, the strictly magical conduit used for high-priority officer relay. Nothing. The system responded, but the receiving end didn't exist. Lunar Tower had ceased to occupy the same physical or metaphysical space as Stone Fang. I stood there staring at the humming wires, realizing for the first time that the threat we faced was not one of swords or fire, but something that defied material engagement. I decided to check the nearby supply village, little more than 36 wooden structures nestled in a ravine 3 miles west. I arrived to the same clean, chilling void. Just before giving up, I found a relic in the foundation of the village apothecary. It was a thin, fire-blackened slate tablet, clearly salvaged from a much older ruin. The script etched into the stone was archaic and painfully familiar. It was the script of the old vampire language, the one forbidden under imperial decree for nearly 600 years. I read it easily, having studied it secretly during my academy days, drawn to the texts the Empire tried so hard to eliminate. The message was brief and horrifying. It spoke not of war or plague, but of the harvest of the void. A time when the world, tired of being consumed, began to peel itself back. I had always prided myself on my rational mind, on my absolute disdain for superstition and prophecy. But holding that hot, acrid stone, surrounded by the perfect chilling evidence of absence. A genuine cold knot of terror coiled in my stomach. As I secured the tablet in my satchel, a shadow fell over me. I spun around, weapon drawn, my breath catching in my throat. Investigator Hardlow. The voice was tired, etched with the same horror I was beginning to feel. It was Captain Caden Merrow of the Northern Guard. He was a refugee. His usually impeccable uniform was ripped and streaked with soot. He led 2 men, both of whom kept looking over their shoulders into the snowbanks. "Merrow," I confirmed, holstering my sidearm. "I thought you were 20 miles east, patrol routing. We were a platoon of 20. We were routing toward Stone Fang for resupply." "We were hit by nothing," he said, his voice flat. "They didn't fight. They didn't bleed. They just dissolved." 1 minute, Sergeant Torvis was marching beside me, complaining about his boots. The next minute, only his boots were left, standing upright in the snow. No sound, no struggle, just gone. Caden confirmed what I already knew. The chain of command was broken. We sat in the cold village, 2 cogs suddenly removed from the massive Imperial machine, realizing the machine itself was grinding to a halt. We agreed instantly to move south together, a mutual understanding forming between an officer of internal affairs and a captain of the line that our commanders were either taken or willfully blind. We started moving within the hour, following the strange, erased trenches south. That night, under a sky that seemed too dark, too close, the first strike came. We were making camp when the air itself condensed. The temperature dropped instantly, violently. It was not a natural cold. It was the cold of absolute vacuum. A silhouette rose from the snow, roughly humanoid yet utterly formless, composed of swirling darkness and crystalline flakes. This was a void-blooded. It made no sound, but its presence pressed against my eardrums, creating a high, painful pitch of wrongness. Caden let out a howl, reverting instantly to his massive wolf form, his fur bristling, and he charged. But his claws simply passed through the creature's midsection. The void-blooded reached out, and where its shadow hand touched the snow, the flakes vanished, leaving only raw dirt. "Don't touch it," I yelled, fumbling for the only thing I carried that fought this kind of enemy. A small, specialized magical lantern designed for probing dimensional pockets. I ripped the lantern from my pack and ignited the runic core. A pure, blinding white light erupted. It was not heat, but essence. The moment the light hit the void-blooded, the shadowy figure recoiled, letting out a shriek that felt less like sound and more like the ripping of fabric. The thing retreated rapidly, sinking back into the darkness. We stood gasping, the unnatural cold receding only marginally. We had won a moment, but I knew, looking at the 2 terrified men Caden still commanded, that this was not a war of attrition. This was a fight against reality itself, and reality was losing its patience. The journey south was a descent into accelerating chaos. The massive, smoothed trenches of absence continued to score the landscape, occasionally intersecting, creating vast, perfect circles where the earth itself had been polished away. We moved fast, keeping the magic lantern close, relying on Caden's tracking skills, which remained frighteningly accurate even as the landmarks faded. We spent the next 4 days moving in a state of hypervigilance, and by the time we reached the Midlands, the truth of the Imperial crisis was painfully evident, even without direct communication. The villages we passed were not empty. They were frantic. In one small town, We watched as the local magistrate attempted to calm a crowd, insisting the sporadic disappearances were small boundary flare-ups caused by rogue vampires. His voice was thin and reedy, a desperate lie covering a monumental truth. We learned, through overheard whispers and desperate, drunken confessions, about the escalating paranoia within the capital, Lunar Tower. The whispers confirmed that Regent Cassandra Virus was locked in a bitter struggle with her council. The councilors, puffed up with 7 centuries of conquest and hubris, refused to acknowledge anything beyond a terrestrial threat. They clung to the narrative of vampire conspiracy or gnome rebellion, blinded by their own imperial pride. I had known Cassandra from a distance, a ruthless but pragmatic leader. She had taken the reins after the Emperor vanished 3 years prior. Cassandra acted swiftly behind the scenes, maintaining a hard, unyielding public facade. We saw posters being nailed up, hastily printed decrees commanding immediate enforced preparations for evacuation, disguised as routine mobilization. This was her secret work, done under the cloak of maintaining public confidence and supporting the council's foolish narrative. It was this duplicity that allowed us to survive. We infiltrated the outer defenses by posing as a returning scouting party, only possible because the imperial structure was still pretending to function, right down to the checkpoint guards who mechanically waved us through, too terrified to question anything. Inside the perimeter, the decay was palpable. We learned that the blood anchoring ritual, the massive, highly publicized magical ceremony intended to reinforce the city's ancient shields, had failed catastrophically 2 days before our arrival. We spoke to a distraught apprentice mage who had witnessed the event. They brought out the Archmagi. The young man wept, huddled in a supply tent. He tried to weave the essence, to bind the shields to the bedrock of the world, just as they always did. But when the magic hit the ground, it rebounded. The Archmagi just started screaming, his eyes bleeding. He kept crying that there was nothing to anchor to, nothing solid left. The foundations were too thin. That was the terrifying crux of the problem. The magic wasn't being blocked. It was failing because the fundamental reality it relied on had eroded. Caden and I decided we needed to get closer to the core, to Lunar Tower itself. But the city was a warren of escalating panic. We saw the direct consequence of Cassandra's desperation and the Council's greed. 3 years ago, the Regent had orchestrated the deployment of the main Imperial armies, the colossal war packs, to conquer the mythical dwarf mines across the southern sea. She had done it for the resources, for the final ultimate expansion of the Empire's resource base. Now the heartland was exposed, saved only by a scattered, insufficient northern guard and a terrified civilian populace. The city shuddered beneath a suppressed fever. We moved through the crowded marketplaces, keeping our heads down. Then the silence broke. It was instantaneous. A monumental granite statue of Emperor Velkin, the founder of the Werewolf Empire, stood 20 feet tall in the central trade plaza, a symbol of permanence and strength. 1 minute it was there, covered in the usual grime and bird droppings. The next, it was gone, not shattered, not vandalized. It simply wasn't there. There was no dust, no rubble, no sound of collapse. The statue's existence had been quietly deleted from the fabric of reality. The cobblestones beneath it were smooth and unmarked, as if nothing had ever stood there. The ensuing wave of panic was absolute. People screamed not out of shock, but out of a deeper, primal terror. This wasn't an enemy they could fight. It was a cosmic retraction. Imperial guards, our own brethren, rushed in. They didn't try to comfort or explain. They used brutal, swift force to suppress the mob. I watched as Cassandra herself, mounted high on a warhorse, surveyed the chaos from a balcony. Her face was a mask of cold fury and calculation. She gave the signal, and the guards moved with efficient savagery, beating the citizens back, restoring a semblance of order through sheer brutality. "She's holding it together by sheer terror," Caden muttered beside me, his knuckles white. "The only thing worse than the Void is a regent who will kill her own people to keep them from realizing they're already lost." "It's effective," I responded grimly. "If the city falls into anarchy before the Void takes it, we won't have a chance to find out what's happening." We kept moving, avoiding the main routes, heading toward the older, less used tunnels that led toward the center. We were close enough now to feel the city's pulse, a panicked, erratic thump. I heard the quiet, subterranean hum of the magic shielding, flickering like a dying candle. The truth of the Archmagi's screams echoed in my mind. The shield was failing because the world beneath it was no longer there. We had to find a way to the Imperial archives. If anyone held the truth about what the Empire had actually done, it was in the history they tried to bury. We reached the border city of Valence, 20 miles from the capital, late the following evening. The city was already in the throes of self-cannibalization. The ingrained Imperial hatred for all non-werewolf races had metastasized into blind, murderous fear. The streets were lit by roaring fires, not of defense, but of ethnic cleansing. Bands of Imperial citizens, mostly civilian werewolves, hunted down anyone who looked different, human traders, distant cousins of the Shadow Beastkin, even those who simply lacked the pure silver sheen of Imperial lineage. "We have to intervene," Caden snarled, already halfway shifted, his eyes yellow with outrage. I didn't argue. We cut through a narrow alley, stumbling upon a half-dozen drunken werewolves dragging a human woman and her small child toward a bonfire. The battle was short and brutal. We were fighting our own people, the men who should have been guarding the frontiers. We used the butt of our rifles and closed-fisted blows, avoiding permanent injury but hitting hard enough to drop them. "Remember the mission, Caden," I panted, helping the human woman escape into the darkness. "We can't save them all, and we can't afford to be arrested for mutiny here." The violence settled a grim truth between us. The system we had served was eating itself alive long before the Void arrived. We continued our traverse of the city, keeping to the shadows. As we approached the northern gate, now ironically guarded by mobs, not soldiers, we were ambushed. A sudden, chilling hiss echoed from the rooftops. Before we could react, we were surrounded by 6 figures. Lean, shadowy forms, distinctly non-werewolf, armed with archaic obsidian weaponry. Tenebrous beastkin. We had fought these ancient enemies on the borders for years. They were savage, swift, and driven by generations of hatred for the Empire. Caden and I braced, ready for a fight to the finish. But the assault never came. The leader, a gaunt male with eyes that burned like amber coals, held up a hand. He spoke in a low, guttural cadence, the sound carrying a genuine weariness I had never associated with their kind. "We heard the silence on the snow," he rasped. "Your arrogance poisons the world, werewolf. But this is not your war alone. I lowered my rifle slightly, confused. "What are you doing?" "We are retreating," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the south, away from the Imperial lands. "The void has come for everyone, even those of us who kept to the shadows. Do not follow us. Seek only the unblemished refuge, the place your masters poisoned with the very thought of conquest." With that cryptic warning, the 6 beastkin vanished as swiftly and silently as they had appeared, leaving us standing alone in the alley. The alliance was not made of words, but of shared fear. Even the deepest hatred was superseded by a deeper, cosmic dread. Caden, stripped of his faith and his loyalty, was desperate for action. We found an abandoned Imperial signal tower. He insisted on trying to use the ancient signal system, massive stone braziers meant to burn enchanted wood, sending plumes of smoke hundreds of miles into the southern regions. "The radio waves are dead. The old magic must still work," he argued, his hands shaking as he piled the dried wood. "We have to warn the garrisons down south. We can still save something." He lit the pyre with a captured magical sparker. The wood caught instantly, but the resulting fire was unnatural. Instead of the thick white smoke used for signaling, a viscous, churning black gas erupted. It didn't rise. It spread horizontally, filling the air with a stench like scorched copper and curdled sanity. The gas instantly overwhelmed Caden's 2 remaining men, Private Valian and Corporal Yarrow. They began to tear at their own eyes, babbling about the darkness swallowing the colors. Caden screamed, reverting to his base form, but it was too late. He was forced to make an impossible decision. He slammed his rifle butt down, ending Velian's agony, and then used his bare hands to stop Yarrow before the man could hurt himself further. Caden stood over their bodies, breathing heavily, the remnants of the black gas swirling around his feet. "The command chain is fully dead, Graven," he whispered, his voice raw. "It doesn't want to hear us. It wants to consume us." While Caden dealt with the grim reality of the signal fires, I spread out the tactical maps I had brought from Stone Fang. They were standard Imperial issue, drawn and consecrated by the capital's cartographers. But as I watched, the ink shifted. The finely drawn lines marking the territories of the southern provinces began to blur and darken. New unauthorized mountains and rivers appeared in the west, areas that Imperial scouts insisted were barren plains. The central provinces, the wealthy, resource-rich heartland, were fading into a sickly pale gray. It wasn't an ink spill. The geography of the world was literally unraveling, being rewritten by the trauma of the void. Our destination, Lunar Tower, seemed to be holding, but the rest of the world was dissolving around it. "We need to reach the tower now," I told Caden, pointing to a faded section of the map, "before the whole thing is erased." We pushed on, reaching the main Imperial Highway 2 hours later, and stopped dead. The highway, built centuries ago to connect the capital to the north, was cut by something utterly impossible: a rift. It wasn't a sinkhole or a geological fault. It was a perfectly clean, pulsating tear in the earth, easily 200 yards wide, dropping into an abyss that radiated not cold, but pure, resonant wrongness. From the chasm, we heard a sound, a low, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated in our chests. It sounded like a million voices, screaming not in pain, but in pre-existence. The cry of souls that had never been allowed to fully form. "The road is gone," Caden stated unnecessarily, his wolf eyes wide with shock. "The road is erased," I corrected. tightening my grip on the handle of the magical lantern. We had no choice. The capital was cut off by the geographical breakdown. The only remaining path led through the mountainous crescent known historically as the Crimson Peaks, a territory that belonged exclusively to the major vampire clans for thousands of years, a place the Empire only entered with a full siege army. We were forced to secure passage from our oldest enemy, the vampire clans, either through negotiation or by force. We used every ounce of training and luck to navigate the Crimson Peaks. The terrain was treacherous and the air was thin, but the greater danger lay in the myriad traps and wards the vampires had erected over the millennia. We were ghosts in their territory, relying solely on the faint, forgotten paths used by smugglers and dissidents. As we neared Lunar Tower from the west, the landscape began to shift again, the earth around the capital taking on a sickly, almost plastic appearance, as if stretched too thin. I learned the details of the capital's internal collapse only upon our arrival at the outer walls, through a nervous lieutenant who recognized Caden. The news was shocking, confirming the breakdown of reality we had been witnessing. 2 hours before we reached the perimeter, Valkyrin Raynor, heir to the most powerful vampire clan, had done the impossible. He walked into Lunar Tower uninvited. The lieutenant described Valkyrin not as a conquering enemy, but as a phantom, pale, gaunt, his regal armor dust-covered, his face etched with an exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. He had not come to attack. He had come to beg. He demanded audience with the regent, the lieutenant whispered to me in a dark corner of the supply depot, his eyes darting nervously. He said the void was entering through the old crypts, the places where only the dead rested. He called it the drawing out of the foundation. Valkyrin's testimony to Cassandra was simple and devastating. His massive clan, the Raynor bloodline, was almost entirely gone. They hadn't been killed by swords or fire. They had been extracted, their ancient tombs turned into pockets of perfect, empty nothingness. If the void was consuming the undead who subsisted on non-living energy, then no one was safe. The scene described to me was agonizingly tense. Cassandra, fiercely protective of imperial doctrine that demanded the summary execution of any vampire caught within city limits, stood over Valkyrin, her hand hovering over the arrest mechanism. But the regent, faced with evidence of an existential threat that bypassed all political and racial boundaries, chose survival over dogma. She saw the genuine terror in the vampire's eyes, a fear far beyond the dread of mortal death. She agreed to an alliance. This was the first true schism in imperial history. Cassandra had betrayed 7 centuries of imperial doctrine in a single desperate moment. Valkyrin cemented the alliance with terrifying practical knowledge. He revealed that imperial expansion hadn't just taken land. It had deliberately built its major cities over specific nexus points, places that had once housed pre-imperial wards designed to stabilize reality itself. Lunar Tower sat on one such point, but it was already tainted by centuries of resource extraction. The only safe place, he claimed, was the Unbreakable Valley, ancient ruins built before the Empire existed, located far to the south. He asserted these ruins were designed not as fortresses, but as dimensional anchors, deliberately placed to hold reality together. He traded protection for knowledge, I summarized to Caden, feeling a grim satisfaction. The Empire's downfall was forcing enemies to acknowledge a mutual humanity. The lieutenant then produced the artifact of the agreement, Valkren's ancestral amulet, a piece of deep crimson crystal, pulsing with a faint, steady heat. The regent carries it now. He said it warns her when the void-blooded are close, because his kind can feel their intrusion into the fundamental essence of things. We were discussing the next move when the air above the depot suddenly fragmented. A sound like tearing silk came from the direction of the central keep. It was the signal of a breach. "They're inside the perimeter!" Caden shouted, already drawing his sword. But how? The shields were functional, however weak, I demanded. The lieutenant, pale with fear, offered the horrifying realization. The vampire told the regent that his kind knew every weak spot in the city. The old routes, the forgotten catacombs, the unpatrolled drain systems. He said they used them for infiltration for centuries. And now the void-blooded are using them too, I finished, grabbing my lantern. The vampires had provided a backdoor for themselves, and now the world's retraction was using that same door. We burst out of the depot and saw the immediate results of the invasion. They were fewer in number than a raiding party, but their method was terrifying. The void-blooded, silent and fast, were not attacking the main walls. They were moving through the old city, appearing in the residential districts, leaving only the perfect empty circles where people had stood moments before. My job as an investigator was over. I was now a combat operative in an impossible war. Caden and I led a desperate squad of remaining Imperial infantry, forcing our way toward the keep. We were no longer fighting for the Empire, but for the life of the regent who had chosen pragmatism over hatred. We had to find Cassandra and Valkren. Their knowledge was now the only resource more precious than gold or land. As we ran, I activated the Imperial tracking runes on my coat, hoping the system was still partially functional. It wasn't. But as I passed a fountain, one that had stood since the Empire's founding, I saw a familiar flicker of crimson light. I stopped the squad. The fountain was not dissolving, but something nearby was. A faint red pulse emanated from the second-story window of an adjacent building. It was the vampire's amulet. We kicked the door in. Inside, in a massive, opulent ballroom, stood Cassandra, Valkren, and two of Cassandra's most trusted guards. They were surrounded by the swirling, shadowy forms of the void-blooded. The Alliance was fighting for its life, pinned down in the heart of the capital. The moment they saw us, Cassandra screamed, "Hardlow, Marrow, the western exit, now!" The battle was brief but intense. The light from my specialized lantern, combined with Caden's brutal ferocity and the surprisingly elegant fast strikes of Valkren's black iron sword, drove the void-blooded back. We cleared a path toward the emergency exit, driven by the knowledge that every second we stayed, the foundations of the building were being scraped clean beneath our feet. We ran, four people who should have been mortal enemies, bound together by the sudden, horrifying realization that the Empire's demise was only the beginning of a larger dissolution. The main thoroughfares of Lunar Tower were impossible now, too public, too vulnerable to erasure. Following the ancient, half-collapsed sewer routes suggested by Valkren's knowledge, we moved silently beneath the doomed city. Caden and I led the way, our boots sloshing through the stagnant, cold water. The air in the tunnels was heavy with the smell of wet stone and decay, but it was eerily calm compared to the surface. Above us, we heard the muffled, sporadic screams and the sickening sound of things quietly dissolving. We emerged near the old Imperial Records wing, a sprawling complex that housed centuries of heavily redacted history. We had decided that before seeking Cassandra, we needed the truth, or at least confirmation of our suspicions. The records wing was a monument to irony. A localized magical fire ripped through the main archive room hours earlier, destroying the bulk of Imperial history. The Empire, sensing its end, had tried to erase its paper trail entirely. "A neat job," Caden observed, spitting onto the scorched floorboards. "No witnesses, no evidence. The narrative preserved, even in destruction." I disagreed. It was too thorough. Whoever ordered this was trying to hide a specific, actionable truth, not just save face. Using the training I received as an investigator, I focused not on the grand halls, but on the small, forgotten maintenance closets and private offices. In the back of a clerk's room, behind a massive, tilting bookcase, I found a narrow gap in the wall, too small for a service duct, too well hidden for general access. It led to a small, airless chamber lined with lead plating. Inside, in a dust-coated chest, were the private, hand-bound journals of the last Imperial consul, a man who had mysteriously vanished 5 years before the Emperor's own disappearance. I tore the journals open. The script was cramped, frantic, and damning. The consul had not been a historian. He had been a surveyor. He wrote of the Empire's secret projects, not just conquering land, but physically constricting the boundaries of non-imperial realities. They had measured, charted, and calculated how thin the world became with each conquest, quantifying the reality strain. The goal wasn't just wealth. It was ultimate efficiency, stripping the metaphysical framework of the world to squeeze out the last drop of essence. I read, transfixed, my heart sinking with every line. The Empire wasn't just aggressive. It was fundamentally parasitic. The Void was not an invading enemy from another dimension. It was the world's immune response, the unavoidable consequence of pushing reality past its structural integrity. The text swam before my eyes. We found the limits. We pushed past them. And now the space we stole is simply taking itself back. The world cannot sustain the weight of our hunger. I was raised in absolute loyalty, taught that the Imperial way was the only path to civilization. Now I held the documentation proving that my entire life, my system, my civilization was built on a lie that was actively murdering the universe. "What is it, Graven?" Caden asked, leaning over my shoulder, reading the frantic scrawl about the thinning. Caden went absolutely silent. Then a low, animalistic growl rumbled in his chest. "We built this entire system of lies on the corpses of 1,000,000 worlds," he whispered, his voice shaking. "We were the architects of this destruction." Caden erupted. He grabbed a massive iron pry bar and surged out of the room, heading toward the sound of distant fighting. "There's a concentration of that void smoke near the eastern gate. I'm going to draw them out. I'm going to break something. I will at least die paying for the damned thing." His eyes were manic, driven by a raw, immediate need for moral absolution. I lunged, tackling him against a ruined wall, knocking the pry bar clattering to the ground. "Stop, you fool!" I hissed, holding him down. "You want to die? Go ahead. But understand this. Your death changes nothing. Your personal redemption is meaningless right now. If we don't get to the valley, everyone dies, and the Empire's crimes are simply ratified by universal dissolution. Caden fought me, a heavy, desperate struggle of muscle and fury. I can't live knowing this. I can't. Then die later. I roared, forcing him to meet my gaze. Right now, we are fugitives trying to save the handful of people who might survive this. Focus. The intensity of my conviction broke through his rage. He relaxed, collapsing into a heap, breathing raggedly. Before we could recover, the floor beneath us cracked with explosive force. It was not the void. It was a roar of ancient fury, heavy with sulfur and immense power. Not more of the void, Caden groaned. Worse, I said, peering down the fissure. A demon. The Empire, in its arrogance, had a habit of capturing and entombing powerful entities beneath its major infrastructure to use as arcane batteries or guardians. Now, with the reality grid fracturing, one of those ancient prisoners was released. The creature erupted, a massive, muscular figure cloaked in oily shadow and barbed chains. It was a true, classical demon, smelling of brimstone and hatred. It didn't care about the void or the Empire. It only cared about its freedom and the opportunity to wreak vengeance. It swung a chained fist, tearing open a massive hole in the wall. This fight was agonizingly physical. Unlike the void-blooded, the demon was solid and powerful. We fought dirty using broken masonry and the environmental hazards of the ruins. Caden, still recovering from his emotional breakdown, moved like a cornered animal, dodging the creature's slow, deliberate strikes. I saw the opportunity. The demon was focused entirely on Caden. I found the ancient locking mechanism, a huge iron ring designed to hold the demon's collar, set into a reinforced pillar. I used the last charge in my magical lantern, concentrating the light into a focused beam. The beam didn't hurt the demon, but it momentarily blinded it. Caden screamed a distraction. I lunged, throwing the chain link over the demon's head just as it swung back toward me. I slammed the chain link into the iron ring, locking the mechanism shut with a desperate magical surge. The demon shrieked, instantly constrained by the binding spell of the pillar. It had not been killed, only resealed, trapped once more beneath the city it hated. We staggered back, bloodied and bruised, collapsing against the wall. The fight had cost us precious time and left us physically battered. We need to find Cassandra and Valkyrin, I rasped, struggling to stand. And then we run. We found Cassandra and Valkyrin exactly where the lieutenant had said they would be, in the deepest sub-level of the keep, directing the pathetic final defense of the core city. The sight was surreal. Cassandra, clad in practical leather armor, stood opposite Valkyrin, the vampire lord who was elegantly dressed, but held the weary demeanor of someone who had seen too many millennia end. Caden, covered in dust and demon ichor, and I, holding the damning consul's journal, joined them. 4 people who represented the catastrophic extremes of the fractured world, now forced into reluctant unity. The atmosphere was thick with mutual distrust, a palpable tension that transcended mere prejudice. "The archives are gone, Regent," I stated, placing the consul's journal on a folding table. "But I have the truth. We aren't being attacked, we are being recalled. The void is a consequence, not an enemy." Cassandra didn't flinch. I suspected as much. "Now put that away. We deal with the consequence regardless of the cause. We are moving, now." Before the plan could be formalized, the city's defenses failed completely. The final agonizing wave hit us. It wasn't a charge. It was a haunting entrance. The doors to the bunker dissolved inward, not breaking but simply ceasing to be. In the opening stood dozens of copying void-blooded. They were semi-transparent, indistinct figures of shadow and gray ash, but they had taken on the exact appearance of imperial citizens. Soldiers, cooks, bureaucrats. Their faces were expressionless, their eyes empty holes, and their skin the color of fine bone dust. They did not rush. They merely stood, absorbing the light and life force from the air. Their proximity created a chilling vacuum that sapped strength and hope. "Gods above," Caden whispered, staring at the ghostly figures. "What are they?" Valkren's face went white, betraying the vampire's usual cool composure. He pointed a trembling finger at one figure, a young, lean man standing slightly apart, his empty eyes fixed on Valkren. "That..." Valkren's voice was strained, thick with centuries of suppressed emotion. "That is my brother, my twin. He died in the wars of founding 1,000 years ago." A horrifying realization dawned on me. These copies were not demons or projections. They were the potential existences, the alternate realities, the lives that the Empire's expansion had actively crushed, now returning as spectral tax collectors. Valkren was staring at a version of his brother that the Empire's conquest had precluded from existence. "He would have been a better man than I," Valkren muttered, drawing his black iron sword. The copy was beautiful and terrible, moving with the faint, fluid grace of a ghost. It advanced slowly toward Valkren. The vampire, facing the most devastating moral trauma of his existence, had to choose. He chose survival. With a guttural cry, Valkren lunged forward, his ancient blade slicing through the phantom chest of his mirror. The copy let out no sound, but the entire room shuddered. The figure turned instantly to ash, leaving only a small, lingering patch of unnatural cold. Valkren stood panting, his shoulders slumped, the weight of the moral sacrifice evident in his every movement. The immediate crisis forced the four of us into grim, efficient action. We developed a plan of final retreat to the unbreakable valley. The group was small, a few hundred remaining survivors, both military and civilian, huddled in the eastern quarter. The plan was a symphony of necessary sacrifices. Caden, stripped of his initial zeal for suicidal redemption, grimly accepted the role of organizing the desperate infantry, forming a final defensive perimeter designed to hold the line for 20 minutes, no longer. Valkren, his resources already taxed, would use his depleted reserves to weave a massive, temporary magical field, an energy dome to shield the evacuation route from the dissolving rain. My job was to secure the fuel and the means of immediate destruction, to ensure the capital's remains would not follow us. Cassandra's role was the hardest. She had to create the exit point. We discussed the exit routes. The supply depot, the only source of non-magical fuel for our escape transports, lay across the massive, structurally integral Imperial Bridge. The bridge was key to the city's infrastructure. Cassandra pointed to the map, tracing a line around the western section of the capital, the densely populated civilian housing districts. "We blow the bridge," she declared, her voice devoid of inflection. "It secures the eastern flank for retreat, and the detonation will create a necessary distraction." Caden shook his head, his face a mask of disbelief. "Regent, there are at least 1,000 civilians still trapped in the western districts. If we collapse the only major access point, they are cut off. They will starve before the void takes them." "Then they will starve," Cassandra said, meeting his horrified gaze with cold certainty. "If we wait even an hour more, we all dissolve. I am choosing 100 lives over 1,000 deaths. The bridge goes. Now. It was the ultimate act of imperial pragmatism, distilled to a terrifying core. She had shed the old dogma to save the world, but she retained the ruthless efficiency that valued survival above all morality. I felt a fresh wave of disgust, but I nodded. Her logic, cold as ice, was unassailable. We had no choice but to burn the bridges, literally and figuratively. I grabbed the coordinates for the necessary explosives. "Let's go, Graven," Caden said, his voice flat. He was moving not out of loyalty, but out of grim acceptance. The age of comfortable moral certainty was over. The final hours in Lunar Tower were less a battle and more an agonizing, protracted amputation. We were shedding the remnants of the Empire, sacrificing structure and people to secure a slim chance of survival. My mission took me into the heart of the dissolving administrative complex, searching for the caches of powerful magical weaponry the Empire had decommissioned. Meanwhile, Caden directed the skeletal remains of the Northern Guard in their hopeless 20-minute stand on the central square. The Lunar Tower itself, the 70-story monument to imperial pride, began its agonizing demise exactly as Valkyrin predicted. The Void-Blooded had surrounded its base, not attacking it with physical force, but simply unmaking the stone. From my vantage point in the arms depot, I watched through a smoked window as the tower's granite base turned into a column of gray mist, rising silently into the unnaturally dark sky. It wasn't collapsing, it was evaporating. The sheer, overwhelming horror of watching a symbol of permanence simply cease to exist broke the last slivers of military discipline in the civilian survivors. I found the cache I was looking for in the deepest chamber of the depot, guarded by General Vorlag, my old mentor. Vorlag was slumped against a crate, his leg mangled by falling masonry, his breathing shallow. "Graven," he whispered, a smile of terrible relief on his face. "You found it." On the pedestal stood the incendiary sphere, a weapon of such volatile magical energy that its use had been banned for centuries. It would not just explode. It would create a temporary, localized vacuum of energy, pushing back the void long enough for the escape convoy to move. But activating it required an immediate conscious sacrifice, the life force of the initiator. They didn't give me enough time to prime the remote activation runes, Vorlag rasped, pointing to the sphere. "It has to be manual." I felt a punch of sickening dread. Vorlag was gravely wounded. He wasn't going to survive the night regardless, but this was a choice he offered me. The choice to leave him to his fate, or to use his last moments for the greater terrible good. "You're telling me this is your path's end, sir?" I managed, my voice tight. "It is," he affirmed, clutching a detonation wire. "Go. The convoy moves in 10 minutes. Tell Cassandra to remember what we did here. Not for the Empire, but for the life we are trying to save." The agony of that moment was profound. Vorlag was the closest thing I had to a father figure. The man who had taught me integrity in a corrupt world. Now, I was accepting his desperate, violent end to buy us 10 minutes of life. I didn't waste time on sentiment. I embraced him fiercely, a final, wordless salute, and ran, carrying the necessary fueling rods for the escape vehicles. Behind me, the Lunar Tower continued to dissolve, the immense structure shrinking under the weight of non-existence. As I broke into the open, I saw the blinding light of Valkyrin's defensive magic. The vampire was standing at the threshold of the evacuation zone, arms spread wide, sweat pouring down his unnaturally pale face. A shimmering dome of deep crimson light protected the survivors, but the power was visibly draining him. His hands were shaking, and I saw the fine black lines appearing beneath his eyes, the exhaustion of burning up his deep ancestral reserves. He saw me, his eyes momentarily losing focus. Hardlow. The light won't hold. The cost is too great. I am an empty shell now. I am entirely dependent on her leadership and your protection. It was the ultimate admission of vulnerability, a statement of utter defeat for the proudest race in the world. Valkyrin had paid his price. I reached Cassandra as she stood on a makeshift stage, surrounded by the 100 or so terrified survivors, a mix of soldiers, low-level bureaucrats, and essential workers. She had a megaphone, and her face was illuminated by the destructive light of Valkyrin's shield. She did not offer hope or false promises. "Look at this city," she commanded, her voice ringing with brutal clarity. "Look at the tower. It is gone. The name is gone. The structure is gone. The power that we cherished, that we worshipped, is gone." She threw her ceremonial imperial cloak into a muddy puddle, deliberately stamping on the gold trim. "The Empire is over!" she shouted. "I refuse the title. I reject the command structure. You are not soldiers of the Werewolf Empire. You are free people. You are survivors. Your survival is your only duty now. Follow Marrow. Follow Hardlow. We run to the valley, or we dissolve here. There is nothing left to rule." The ensuing silence was broken only by the muffled sounds of the exploding bridge. General Vorlag had honored his terrible commitment. A massive shockwave hit us, followed by a shower of debris, and the sudden, terrifying sight of the Western District sealed off, abandoned to the quiet horror of the void. Cassandra's declaration was the final nail in the imperial coffin. She was no longer a regent burdened by politics, but a desperate leader focused purely on logistics. She signaled the convoy. The incendiary sphere had done its work. The path was clear momentarily of the immediate threat. We piled into the heavy armored vehicles, Caden at the lead, driving them out through the crater left by the vanished tower. We drove south, leaving behind a city that was rapidly becoming an echo. We were barely 100 miles south of the fallen capital when the environment turned against us. We had crossed the ruined road, avoiding the pulsing rift by traveling across ancient overgrown tracks. Now the open plains, once the breadbasket of the Empire, became a hostile element. The storm of erasing hit us without warning. It wasn't rain or snow, but a supernaturally aggressive wind. It was the air itself trying to correct the imbalance, literally scouring the surface of anything that wasn't anchored to deep, fundamental rock. The wind tore at the convoy, ripping the canvas from the supply trucks and stripping the paint from the armored plating. We had approximately 100 werewolves and a handful of dozen surprisingly resilient vampires forced to travel together. Caden, stripped of his remaining men and driven by the desperation of his failure in the city, took the lead, guiding the column across the shifting, ravaged ground. He moved with a grim, exhausted efficiency, constantly sweeping ahead to test the stability of the terrain. The void blooded, unable to sustain a physical presence in the intense wind, changed tactics. They began to attack from within the column. Not physically, but as sudden, sharp drops in temperature, small, localized pockets of non-existence that consumed a single person from the ranks. We heard a muffled shriek, turned, and found only a pair of boots left behind. The effect on morale was catastrophic. The werewolves began to look at the vampires with cold suspicion. They blamed Valkyrn's magic, his unnatural presence, for drawing the enemy. They are the ancient enemy. Their dark blood is a magnet for this evil. A burly sergeant named Rost exclaimed, gathering a small group of desperate soldiers. They moved quickly, attempting to corner Valkyrn and his remaining kin. Valkyrn, weakened and physically fragile from his magical exertion, stood ready, but he was outnumbered and exhausted. Cassandra intervened with immediate, terrifying authority. She stepped between the howling werewolves and the silent vampires, her face stone. "Stop," she ordered. The sergeant ignored her, raising his weapon. Valkyrn, demonstrating the worth of his alliance, didn't fight back, but instead focused his remaining energy outward. A thin wave of magical energy pulsed from him, washing over the surrounding terrain. For a moment, the void's influence around us stuttered, the random disappearances ceasing. "His magic pushes the void back," Cassandra stated, pointing at Valkyrn. "Your stupidity invites it in." She gave Rost, the instigator, one chance to stand down. He refused, fueled by hatred and fear, insisting that the only way to save the pack was to cleanse it. Cassandra drew her Imperial issue rifle and, without hesitation, placed a precise shot into Rost's head. The sergeant fell dead, his attempt at rebellion instantly and brutally quashed. The silence that followed was absolute. Cassandra had just executed one of her own kind, a loyal officer, to protect a vampire. The lesson was learned. The old hierarchy was dead, and her authority, based purely on the necessity of survival, was absolute. "We keep moving," she commanded, not bothering to look at the body. "The next man to speak of race will join him." I continued to consult the ancient maps I had recovered alongside the consul's journals. It was clear that the Unbreakable Valley was a deliberate omission. The maps I carried, which were generations old, showed a massive void where the valley should have been. Only the consul's frantic notes indicated a place name. I realized the stunning truth of the irony. The valley was located precisely where the Empire had chosen to build its most secure hidden containment facility, a massive underground prison for its most dangerous magical and political opponents. The Empire had literally built its tools of destruction upon the only thing that could save it, attempting to erase the memory of the location entirely. Our salvation lay in a place our people had condemned and worked for centuries to forget. We pressed onward, driven by the fear of the storm and the memory of Cassandra's resolve. We reached the Black River, a major tributary that once flowed south to the coast. Now, its waters were thick, black, and corrosive, the color of crude oil mixed with ash. The passage was narrow, requiring careful navigation. As we crossed the unstable, crumbling ford, a child slipped from his mother's grasp, falling toward the acidic current. Caden, forgetting his self-doubt and his broken loyalty, plunged instantly into the water. He grabbed the child and threw him onto the bank, safe. But Caden himself struggled back, screaming. The black water reacted violently to his touch. He emerged with massive burns across his arms and chest, the flesh smoking and bubbling, corroded by the toxic water. It wasn't just physical harm. The water ate at the very structure of his being, the part that connected him to his transformation ability. He kept walking, staggering, forcing himself onward. I supported him, watching the light fade from his eyes. He had saved a life, but the river had extracted a terrible toll. His physical strength was gone, replaced by a hollow exhaustion. He had bought us the passage, but I knew, looking at the unnatural wounds, that Caden Marrow, the powerful wolf, was dangerously close to ending his path. We saw the valley before we felt it. After days of traversing landscapes that were either vanishing or actively trying to scrub us from existence, the sight was a shock to the senses. The unbreakable valley was a pocket of vibrant, almost aggressive life. The vegetation was impossibly lush, deep greens and yellows that had been absent from the world for weeks. A river flowed within, clean and crystalline, reflecting the healthy cerulean blue of a sky we hadn't seen in months. The air here was heavy with the smell of damp earth and living things. It was peace, bought at a terrible price. But the approach was immediately blocked by a shimmering, invisible barrier, an ancient, complex shield of broken, humming runes. This wasn't a paradise. It was a sanctuary protected by the desperate, failing magic of a forgotten era. It was holding back the void, but it was also designed to keep everything else out, especially us. As the 100+ survivors gathered nervously outside the barrier, the protective mechanism activated. A presence materialized at the perimeter, the ancient defender. It was a massive, crystalline humanoid, its body woven from pure light and the mineral structure of the deep earth. Its voice was deep and reverberating, carrying the immense weight of time. "You carry the scent of the usurper," the defender boomed, the sound shaking the ground. "You are the Werewolf Empire, the first to break the boundary, the civilization built on theft. You are forbidden here. You will not pass." The defender was designed to prevent exactly what we were attempting, to find refuge in the one place the Empire couldn't touch. The irony was suffocating. Cassandra stepped forward, ready to argue logistics and necessity, but Valkyrin stopped her. "It speaks the language of essence, Regent." "Not politics," the vampire said, his eyes closed. "It responds to the blood, to the history." Valkyrin, utterly exhausted, stepped to the barrier, his hands raised. He spoke not in the common tongue, but in a low, complex language of blood and resonance, the dialect of ancient mages and things that lived outside of mortal concerns. "I am Valkyrin Raynor," he declared, his voice thin but carrying authority. "My lineage preceded the werewolf's arrogance. My people were the guardians of the balance, the silent witness to their destruction. I have lost my home, my family, and my strength fighting the consequence of their ambition. I do not come as an attacker. I come as a fugitive, seeking a space to rebuild the balance." He focused his remaining magical force, not into an attack, but into a transaction. He didn't offer his own blood. He offered the substance of his existence. Valkyrin reached inside himself, gathering the remaining vestiges of his vampire life force, the magic that kept him alive and strong, and with a visible wrench, he pushed it through the barrier. The act cost him terribly. He gasped, his body collapsing inward slightly, the fine lines of his exhaustion deepening into severe cracks. He looked centuries older, shrunken. The crystalline defender paused, analyzing the offering. "You pay the tribute of humility, not conquest. You have surrendered your power to seek balance. The price is acceptable." The defender opened a narrow, temporary slit in the runic barrier, wide enough to admit our huddled group. As the first survivors filed in, the ground outside the valley began to groan. The void-blooded, sensing the impending loss of their quarry, initiated a final, desperate attack. The very air around the valley began to thicken, the light bending violently. The void was trying to rip the valley open, to consume the last shred of stable reality. The runic barrier began to fail, its protective hum stuttering and dying under the sheer force of non-existence pressing upon it. Caden, pale and barely able to walk from the corrosive injuries he sustained at the Black River, saw the impending collapse. He pushed past me, ignoring my protests. Graven. The runes on the east spire. They're the fulcrum. I know the ancient pattern from the scouting reports. He stumbled toward the ancient, crumbling stone spire that anchored the valley's defense. He was moving on pure will, his human form fragile and weak. He began to pound his fists onto the stone, not in a desperate attack, but in an act of reinforcement, pushing the last remnants of his strength, his fading, elemental werewolf power, into the collapsing matrix. The effort was visible agony. Caden's body convulsed, his screams tearing from his throat. He was paying the ultimate price. He was physically welding the rune structure with his own fundamental connection to the world, sacrificing that connection to keep the barrier sealed. The light from the spire flared blindingly, a final act of elemental power, holding the encroaching darkness at bay. "Seal it, Graven. Now!" Caden roared, his voice laced with the sound of snapping bone. Cassandra and I, working together with the few remaining operational mages, slammed the final 2 rods into the primary energy conduits. A resonant, massive thud echoed, and the runic barrier snapped shut, whole and strong once more. The void's fury outside was muted, frustrated. We were safe. We rushed to Caden. He lay still, his body slack, breathing shallowly. He had survived the physical trauma, but something fundamental was extinguished. "He saved us," Cassandra whispered, her voice heavy with awe. I felt for his pulse, then checked the magical residue. The elemental connection was severed. His body had rejected the corrosive effects of the river and the strain of the ultimate sacrifice. He was alive, whole, breathing, but permanently changed. Caden Marrow, the powerful captain of the Northern Guard, the fierce wolf, was no more. He was now irrevocably, permanently human. The price of their survival was the complete dismantling of the werewolf empire's very nature. The unbreakable valley lived up to its name, but it was not a reprieve. It was merely a strategic withdrawal. The lush interior, though pristine, was contained and finite. We were refugees in a pressurized temporary bubble of reality. The immediate task was survival. The 150-odd survivors, werewolves, vampires, the few human and beastkin we had picked up, began the work of setting up the new camp. We found the valley was indeed a ruined civilization. Within the central ruins, we uncovered deep scrolls and carvings, not of conquest but of warning. They explained in exhaustive detail how to maintain the local artificial stability, rules for resource management, limitations on population, and the absolute necessity of respecting the elemental balance. We learned that the inhabitants of this pre-imperial age had known about the world's fragility. They understood that constant expansion and infinite desire led only to cosmological retraction. They built this place not as a shelter, but as a seed for a new beginning. Our ancestors had seen this truth, ignored it out of greed, and buried the knowledge. The discovery cemented the grim consensus among the leadership. The Empire was guilty, and the current crisis was deserved. Our peace was short-lived. I was coordinating the construction of the protective palisade when I heard the scouts screaming from the North Pass. The void-blooded couldn't penetrate the valley's ancient, renewed magic. But they were doing something far worse. They were surrounding us. I climbed the highest remaining watchtower alongside Cassandra. The scene outside the shimmering runic barrier was horrifying. The land around the valley was no longer dissolving sporadically. It was actively being consumed. The void-blooded, million-strong, were forming a solid, visible perimeter. A massive, churning cloud of perfect, impenetrable darkness, a cocoon of non-existence, was closing in on the valley. It was a constantly expanding patch of zero reality, a permanent scar on the face of the world. We were trapped in a fragile pocket of existence, watching the universe outside contract around us. We were safe for the moment, but the war had merely transitioned from mobile combat to a siege of the metaphysical. The time for titles and political posturing was long over. Cassandra called the survivors together for a final assembly, standing before the makeshift common fire. "The Empire is a memory," she announced, her voice strong and clear. "Our old rules, our old hatreds, are the reason the cocoon is out there. If we survive together." She formally divested herself of all remaining authority, establishing the Council of the Last Light. The new ruling body was composed of representatives of all the salvaged races. The most shocking moment came when she named Valkyrin Raynor, the ancient vampire, as her equal, a co-leader in the new order. A low, muttering sound of dissent rose from the surviving werewolf soldiers. They were broken, but the instinctual hatred was still there. Valkyrin stepped forward, ignoring their hostility. "I have lost everything to the void," he stated, his voice quiet but commanding. "I ask for no power, only a place to protect what little remains of the world. My knowledge of the deep systems is essential to maintaining this refuge." The dissent withered under the shared understanding of their position. Cassandra's authority was gone, replaced by the crushing reality of collective vulnerability. I accepted my new role as the chief archivist and strategist, tasked with deciphering the ancient scrolls and directing the limited resources. I returned to the watchtower, looking north. There, 500 miles away, where Lunar Tower and the vast heart of the imperial capital had once stood, was nothing. Not rubble, not smoke. Just a vast, shimmering vacuum, a perfect, dizzying sphere of non-being. It was the perfect negation, silent and terrifying. I felt a cold, hard certainty settle in my chest. The war was far from over. We had merely purchased time in a sealed tin can, waiting for the air to run out. As the first unnatural chill of the early winter descended upon the valley, Valkyrin, Cassandra, Caden, and I stood together by the main runic anchor. Caden was wrapping his damaged hands, resigned to his new, fragile humanity. "We didn't defeat the void," Cassandra observed, watching the dark, swirling edge of the cocoon. "We simply chose a smaller, more desperate place for our struggle." "But it is a struggle built on truth, not lies," I responded, holding the consul's heavy journals. "We know why this happened." Valkyrin nodded, his expression severe. "We build not a fortress, but a balance. A civilization that must learn to live without devouring others." The remnants of the werewolf empire were gone, melted away by its own ambition. Tomorrow, under the shadow of the cocoon and the authority of an exiled regent, a former investigator, a crippled captain, and a bloodless vampire, the arduous, uncertain journey of the new settlement would begin. It was a humble, fragile start in a world that had almost run out of patience.